Hello there friends, welcome back to another episode of Generation Tech. My name is Alan and we have a little announcement today. We have roughly 3 months before the second season of Andor arrives, which is great because I've been planning on making a video that will fit in perfectly with that series. Many of you guys probably know this channel through the very long form documentaries we've made about the Clone Wars that goes in detail through every major event that happened during that conflict. Today, I want to start an even more ambitious series covering the reign of the Galactic Empire. Starting, of course, with the rise of the Empire after Order 66. Unlike the Clone Wars, which lasted less than 4 years, the Empire was in power for more than 2 decades, and so we're going to be covering a lot more ground here. Events would happen much more gradually during this time period, although if you consider the larger picture of history, the rise and fall of the Empire was just a flash in the pan. The Empire was just a name, and a name alone could not change what the Republic was. A government is made up of various institutions and structures, billions of administrators and workers. You also have the populace, who for the last few 10,000s of years have enjoyed the benefits of democracy and individual liberty. The Republic was also notorious for having a weak central government, which meant that much of the political power and wealth was actually concentrated at the planetary level, especially in the core regions of the galaxy. Emperor Palpatine wanted to change all of this and replace the Republic's complex, multifaceted system of checks and balances with a much more primitive, hierarchical system where he remained at the top alone. But that was easier said than done. You see, the easy part was convincing everyone that the Republic was terrible. It's always easy to tear things down, especially when you've spent the last century or so undermining the Republic's ability to govern with lobbying groups and covert Sith actions. You know, I could go out today and run for alderman in my local city, and I'd probably win if I ran a very negative campaign that just focused on things that people universally hated about this city. It's okay to point out things that are bad, but do I have any solutions for all of those problems? Probably not. And this is the problem with a certain type of populist leader who just focuses on negativity and anger and hatred. They're good at dismantling things, but whether they have solutions to fix these problems is a whole different matter. And so this is where Palpatine finds himself on the eve of Order 66. His plan to destroy the Jedi and take over the Republic in one fell swoop couldn't have gone better. With well over 90% of the Jedi executed, either by their forces in the Yadrim Siege or during Operation Nightfall on Coruscant, the Sith, who have been patiently waiting in the shadows for 1,000 years, have finally dealt that death blow to their hated enemies. And I think this is where Palpatine was ready to usher in an era of dark side dominance, and I think this is where the power and perhaps dark side Sith lightning started getting to his head. Palpatine, in his arrogance, basking in his great success, let his guard down. He started getting sloppy almost immediately with the policies he was carrying out. As a matter of fact, one could argue that post-Sith lightning to the face Palpatine is very different from pre-Sith lightning to the face Palpatine. You see, every long-lasting government survives because of 1 or 2 tricks up its sleeves. And for the Republic, it was this power-sharing agreement it made between itself and all of its member worlds. Palpatine actually understood the system very well. I mean, he manipulated it and used it against itself. So I'm kind of surprised that once he got into power, he didn't realize that things were still unchanged. The Republic started out with only a dozen or so member worlds, all concentrated in the core. And even back then, there were constant disputes between these member worlds over economics, politics, security issues. It was very hard for these individual member planets to sacrifice their own well-being for the greater good, let's just say. But as the Republic grew to hundreds and then thousands of member worlds, it was clear that the central government needed to create a system that could actually work at this scale. As someone who lives on a terrestrial planet with only 2 sentient beings, it's really hard to imagine a government structure that has, thousands of planets, thousands of different species. I mean, the ideas that we have here simply do not scale up to that size, I think. The Republic faced a huge problem as more member states joined their union. The more diluted the individual member states' power became, and so they needed to make a system where it was still appealing to stay, especially because a lot of the original founding member states in the core were really against any kind of continued outflow of political power to the peripherals of the galaxy. The result was a central government that was relatively hands-off when it came to actual local policy. The leaders of the Republic realized that the sheer amount of not only human factions but also alien factions made passing any type of galaxy-wide federal policy incredibly difficult and potentially controversial and dangerous. And so in most cases, the central government just allowed local governments to take care of their own populations. There are of course some larger rules that were enshrined in the Galactic Constitution, like the ban of slavery. But generally speaking, every individual member state could have whatever type of government they wanted, whatever kind of laws they wanted, as long as they didn't do anything crazy like completely abuse its citizens or attack neighboring planets, create super weapons, change the balance of the force. This is why under the umbrella of the Republic's democracy, you had all sorts of crazy systems. There were monarchies, autocracies, direct democracies, hive mind species, AI species, tribal councils. If you could think it up, there was probably a version of that government in the Republic. I mean, this is just a crazy system, and that teaches us a very important lesson. If you live in such a diverse type of society, your best bet at just being sane is being a little bit more relaxed and open-minded and less fearful of the unknown. Otherwise, you're going to go crazy. To be a ruler of such a large galaxy, one needs to accept that other people, sentient beings, are going to have their own ways of life, and it might seem scary, strange, or even dangerous to the wider galaxy, but unless you really understand that species, or society, or faction, and what they've been through, and how and why they've evolved the way they have, it can be kind of hard to judge them. And actually, it did take the Republic a long time to judge them. This is why in the late Republic era, it could take a member or a planet that is applying maybe 1,000 years before they're approved to become a member state. The Republic had to legitimately go through a species history to understand whether they were a good addition or not to the Galactic Republic. This is what made the Republic so great. It was an imperfect system, but they had courage and they believed in their individual member states enough to allow them to do basically whatever they wanted. And because you had local governance, you unlocked the potential of all of these planets, all these species, and you had a very vibrant, diverse, and fortified economic and cultural system, one of the most robust in galactic history. The Republic was wise enough to realize that the only thing it really needed to control for the galaxy to operate smoothly was the economy. The Republic government's main task was just being the guardian for the market. They created standards and regulations for trade, special economic zones, and tax codes. When the Republic found itself dealing with unruly member states, they didn't usually send security forces. Instead, they engaged in economic and political warfare, using sanctions and pressure from other member states to get what they wanted. And if things really got problematic, like when the Nile Marauders started stirring up trouble in the Outer Rim, the Republic would just negotiate with several member states to send their planetary defense forces to solve the problem. The Republic realized that the only thing that really united all of these various species and factions and planets was credits, money. That was kind of like the universal language that worked everywhere in the galaxy, no matter where you went. And because of this, the Republic realized that they could keep planets in line through the threat of being cut off from the economic system. If you really think about it, this is what made the Galactic Republic so impressive. Forget about the Force and giant super lasers. What I'm impressed about is the fact that I can get a pound of Ewok cheeks delivered to my house all the way from Endor, thousands of light years away within just a day. I'm impressed by this galaxy-wide market for goods and services that the Republic has nurtured and grown in the last few tens of thousands of years. This was the prize that most planets wanted when they joined the Republic. They wanted to be a part of this galactic economy so that they could uplift their own people out of whatever, hardships they were facing, all in exchange for paying some taxes and losing a little of their sovereignty. And for all of this to work for the Republic to maintain its control over the galaxy through this exchange of economic access for political power, it needed to be an honest player. It needed to be an objective mediator over the economic system, a power that kept things in balance so that there weren't too many excesses in one direction or another. And it was this very system that the Sith would target and hijack for their own purposes. They were setting up the Republic for failure, which is exactly what they wanted. But what they forgot was they were also planning on taking over the galaxy after everything fell apart, and that includes dealing with all the problems that they created. And so when Palpatine took over, he was facing massive corruption all across the galaxy. The Senate was inundated by corporate actors. The government coffers were almost completely empty because of the terrible war he had started. One of Palpatine's most controversial moves was essentially taking over the entire banking system. In the last year of the Clone Wars, Palpatine would directly nationalize the intergalactic banking clans. They were supposed to be an independent party that helped keep the galactic credits stable, and that meant controlling how much money cost and how expensive it was to borrow credits. If your galactic economy is too heavily leveraged, that could create problems in the future. So the IGBC could increase the cost of borrowing money. At the same time, if your galactic economy is slowing down and there needs to be more growth, they could lower the cost of borrowing money. By removing this independent entity and bringing the IGBC's holding under his control, Palpatine took responsibility of an entire banking system into his own hands. And while that might be desirable for a power-hungry lunatic like Palpatine, ultimately it was unwise to remove this layer of checks and balances, because Palpatine didn't really understand the banking system very well. This is obvious because he would embark in a disastrous, expensive spending spree to grow the Imperial Navy, when the Empire was already on the verge of bankruptcy and didn't have any credits. In the short term, this policy created a lot of jobs and industrial activity, but in the long run, the Empire was running out of money still, and facing either default or hyperinflation. Only a fool couldn't see this coming. I mean, if you look at our own world, even the most chaotic leaders alive, like Vladimir Putin, leave their country's top bankers alone and let them just do their jobs. Another huge mistake that Palpatine made in his last year as Chancellor of the Republic was the sector governance decree. As mentioned before, a lot of power in the Republic is concentrated at the local levels. You see, the galaxy is organized at the sector level. A sector is usually made up of, around 50 planets or systems. Each sector was represented by a senator who talked to the constituents and individual leaders of each planet and then brought those worries and concerns to the wider Galactic Senate. If a sector is allocated government money, it's usually the senator who brings that money back and, facilitates the transaction between the Republic and these local governments. But at the end of the day, most of the work is still done by local leaders when it comes to directing where these funds go and how they're used. The sector governance degree was an attempt by Palpatine to increase the central government's power significantly. He essentially appointed new sector-level governors who were able to coordinate all of the planets in a sector. Using the Clone Wars as a catalyst, Palpatine basically stated that without unity at the sector level, they could not produce enough ships and weapons to match the Separatists. And so, as a result, these new governors could supersede the authority of local leaders and even take control of local production facilities and set quotas for them. These governors were hugely problematic because they had no checks and balances in the local level, and they were not beholden to any of their constituents. They just answered to one person, and that was Palpatine. And so, there's a lot of room for corruption and incompetency. These governors often didn't really understand the local sectors they were taking over, and more importantly, were far more focused on meeting quotas rather than creating a stable and healthy growth environment. And this really mirrored the intentions of Palpatine. He didn't really care about the Empire. He just wanted to grow his military-industrial complex as quickly as possible. This created a disastrous situation where local governors were creating unrest through their extreme policies to meet Palpatine's crazy demands and quotas. If you take a look at it, every government system Palpatine broke ultimately led to more unrest and ultimately led to more people joining the rebellion. He was just a disaster for his own empire. Most leaders, when they overthrow a government and establish a new order, at least try to preserve as much of the old system as possible to make the transition easier. This is so they can focus on one or two specific areas where they have major problems that they really care about or want to reform. Very rarely do you have a Palpatine-like situation where you set on dismantling huge parts of the state immediately. The fact that Palpatine also tried to phase out the clone troopers from the Grand Army of the Republic and their 4-year-old starships, tanks, and blasters and replace it with a completely newly designed military force was just the height of stupidity and waste. Yes, his military spending was a short-term boost to the galactic economy, but actual upgrade to the civil infrastructure, rebuilding worlds that were blown up and destroyed during the Clone Wars would have created long-term returns on investment through taxation. Military weapons typically do not give you good returns at all. Palpatine really did change after the showdown with Mace Windu. The old Palpatine was a rational actor. He was more than willing to make concessions with individuals and let things slide while keeping an eye on the larger picture. But as the Emperor of the Galaxy, he was the complete opposite. Always paranoid and always fearful of everything, he became super focused on very specific projects like creating a super laser or finding immortality. All the while, the Empire began to crumble and fall apart around him. So there you have it, guys. That is our analysis of one of the major factors of why the Empire collapses. And you'll see this in our series, like the whole entire time. It's not really the Rebel Alliance creating all of these problems that eventually cause the Empire to crumble. It's really Palpatine who creates these openings for other factions like the Rebels to come in and exploit. He was ultimately a very bad leader, and he made a lot of mistakes. Well, guys, I hope you enjoyed today's video. Don't forget to subscribe and hit that notification button down below so you don't miss out on the rest of our awesome content. As usual, my name is Alan, reminding you that my allegiance is to the Republic, to democracy. I'll see you next time.